Okay, folks. Well, good morning. My name is Jose Rojas. I'm very happy to be with you today. I'm a program manager within the Azure AD B2C team, been with the team for a little over 2 years, working very closely with some awesome engineers on developing the Identity Express framework, which underlies our B2C service. I'll make the distinction clear to you guys today. This is a technical track, and though it's mostly lecture today, it's just a necessary foundation for the subsequent discussions we're going to have, because we're going to get technical very quickly, and I think that's what you're here for. So let's do it. I think I already made the introduction. We just want to make sure you guys feel comfortable with the basic flows of Identity Express framework, because these are building blocks, right? This is about how to use the Lego blocks. What you create with the Lego blocks is going to be up to you. A quick audience check. Really, the main reason is so we can leverage with each other in terms of where we are in terms of our learning. How many of you have already used B2C with a customer? Fantastic. How many of you have gone into the XML and actually configured in XML? Raise of hands. Great, great. And then similar question, but now for the pre-work itself. How many of you guys were able to complete the pre-work for this session? Getting started with custom policies. That's really good. Kudos to you guys. I think you've heard from our colleagues. We're going to have a few catch-up sessions. One of our biggest goals of your visit today, is that you walk away being able to run through this, so you can then build and be a trainer to your own family, so to speak, your own workmates back where you came from. Okay, so we want to make sure that happens. Okay, that happens this afternoon in the additional session. Tomorrow 7:30 we'll do another session to catch up anybody. And if it's not catch up and you have more complicated questions to ask, come on over. Okay, because we are privileged to have the engineers who actually have coded this and designed it with us today and tomorrow. Please take advantage of it. Awesome. So what we're going to cover through is core concepts and building blocks. We're going to go through a trust framework policy, how it's designed. We have the author, or one of the authors of the language itself with us presenting. And then we're just going to go right into that starter pack to make sure you understand what is it that you did last night when you completed the Get Started. The Identity Experience Framework is a new technology at Microsoft. Relatively new technology, really the team kind of got together a little bit over 3 years ago. And it is a new way to provide composable identity across any entity, ultimately with any protocol. It's almost infinitely configurable. And it's a huge distinction on Microsoft Identity Platform, because it does the identity work for your applications, as opposed to your applications have to do identity work through a bunch of APIs. One of our biggest value adds is that you program the platform. It's your platform, your version of that platform, to provide these services to any number of apps. And those apps have to do a minimum amount of work. It makes sense from a development perspective, control perspective, and from a perspective of control. Security is the last thing I want to say. Control, flexibility, and security. So what does this slide show? And I think my colleague talked about that earlier, so I'm glad that Parag talked about it. We have a platform that our team provides and stands up. And on top of that platform, we've delivered a service called B2C. And we're very proud of what it can do, or what it continue to do. But what IEF can do is goes beyond B2C use cases. And in some of these examples, we had our colleagues at Microsoft Consulting develop a platform on top of it that they sell as a sports platform. And we see you guys on the far left. You are the identity pros. You have ideas, you have products, you have concepts, you have solutions that you know your niches need by vertical, by country, by regulatory body that you're going to provide. We hope you choose us as your platform, but it's your IP that goes on top and you run it. But it also means that you have additional responsibilities to make that happen, both in learning how to configure it and working with us. We really hope you take us up on that, because when you do, you have, through the framework, access to Microsoft services on the left, and you can see the list, as well as any number of services on the right that you can interface with common standards. That's the concept behind it. The Identity Experience Framework is an orchestration engine, I would say, at the core. Hopefully, a common number of you have seen this slide before, but let me walk through it very quickly. We have a user accessing it through a device, and through that device is accessing an application. That's pretty standard. That application is a relying party in an OpenID Connect connection, and that application reaches into the framework and it says, hey, you, this is me. I want to invoke this policy. That policy then says, I want to do this policy through this endpoint. The endpoint dictates what protocol, but beyond that, what the ensuing conversation that happens, it's based entirely on that policy. So your tenant can, in the same tenant, talk to multiple protocols, multiple applications, and solve different problems depending on what you configure in the policy. Because then the orchestration engine can go in sequence through any one of these objects at the bottom. And this is just an example. And what we call out is that even the built-in parts of B2C or IAF are things you can access as if they were external to the platform. That is, your own directory is something you reach out to and you do things with, right? The Azure MFA is something you reach out to and do things with. The beauty of this way to configure is that if you one day choose to use a different Azure MFA, a different MFA service, a different 2SFA service, you can do that. You can go as far as using a user directory somewhere else. You might decide that a Cosmos DB, and now I'm pushing the boundaries, but you might decide that a different kind of database is the right database for your solution. You could do it with our framework. Okay. Now I'm providing these as examples. I'm not encouraging you to go do that, but I want you to understand the modularity that's underneath it to create and complete your cases. I have a little box here, a square box called REST API, which basically becomes everything else in the world that can speak to us via puts and gets, right? And that ability is there. So you configure the middle. Obviously, you have the responsibility for the testing, for the monitoring, and we're going to continue the engine running for you. So let's talk about how this happens. The orchestration engine that you get to program has a number of different pieces and parts to it. I won't go in much detail to it today, but I just want you to be aware and look through the different components. From the upper left, the request orchestration, which comes in. The ability to transform claims so that different entities can talk to each other because the type of the data might be different, because what they call it might be different, because the order of things or the collections versus strings are different. Those things can be transformed so the systems can talk to each other. The orchestrator has to translate between them. And we have a number of ways to do that. In the lower left, the message processing then, that's where the endpoints are very protocol related. And we have a number of protocols we built in, and over time we'll release more protocols. And they all get to be leveraged pretty much the same way. And then on the bottom right, the claims validation service talks about the security, right? The security, whether this is protocol compliant, whether the sender is allowed to be talking to us at a given point in time, and then come out with the tokens that go back to your application. This is what you get to code. This is what you get to configure. So let's go into talk to a little bit about the policies themselves. And let's get theoretical just for a minute. The trust framework itself, in tangible form, is an XML file. But in reality, really, it's kind of a contract. It's kind of a contract that dictates how different parties can talk to each other, what information they can share, what do they each call things. In one platform is called a name, in one platform is called first name, in one platform is called telephone, in another platform is called something else. That legend of how each party talks and who can talk to who, using what protocol and do what, is embodied in the trust framework. Typically, a central body controls this file, this set of files, this configuration, and manages the trust across different parties, right? Even the calling of which keys are to enforce the cryptography between different parties, it's configured in the policy. The keys are somewhere else, but actually what key is invoked in what transaction is invoked in the policy. So that's what the policy does for you. And that trust, so theoretically speaking, defines rules, governs the information exchange, as I talked about. In the example, well, one's blue, one's green, but they're talking to each other in different languages, but the platform gets to translate between them. And lastly, it becomes an auditable document that your customers can review, approve, and unless changes are being done, it's blessed. It's good. Don't touch it until the next review or the next time we need to go back to it. And some organizations are really sensitive about that, and very well they should be. One thing that I find really interesting too is that when the relationships get established in a trust framework, you often do not know, you might not know who all the ultimate governing body is going to be. You don't know how many participants there are going to be. Like, especially in government situations, you don't need to start knowing exactly how many people are going to participate or what are the ultimate rules. You can just get started. And this is what happened specifically in Ireland. The one entity decided to start working with us. And that entity said, hey, I have a good idea. Why don't we create a new identity provider for the government of Ireland? So instead of just solving their problems in that one agency, they kind of looked up and said, let's do something wider. Your customers could do that. You could very well start with one customer in one part of the corporation or one part of the government, and over time, as they see that this works well, the same policies can be adjusted and grow with the situation as opposed to having to rebuild things from scratch. And that's an interesting concept, especially in government, where making major decisions across many organizations is honestly kind of impossible, right? You just got to get started somewhere, and it works. We wanted to clarify that our policies, the policies that we're talking about today, are the same policies that are used in our B2C built-in policies engine, right? Underneath the hood, they are the same policies. But we want to help you quickly think through, when do you need one versus the other? First, the target user, very important. I think you get it. You guys are the identity pros. You guys are the ones that we want to encourage to use the identity experience framework, whereas for most developers, we really want to point them to the kind of get in, get out type service that B2C represents. Configuration, over time, we expect to continue to improve the way you configure the items on the right, but today it is straight up XML editing. But a number of things are the same, right? So UI customization, we have no difference. The ability to do attribute customization, token and session management. It is not our purpose to have any differentiation between the two. We hope that you can do both with either versions of the service. So those are not reasons to move to the right. And lastly, identity providers, over time, we will also allow the one on the left to use any identity provider. That's part of our plan. Today, there's a fixed set of identity providers we've kind of blessed and configured, but the one on the right allows you to use any SAML, any protocol that we support from OpenID Connect, OAuth, and SAML today, and we have a couple coming like WSFed that are in the platform we haven't yet thoroughly tested. In terms of some quick ideas of some of the scenarios we've seen people build, we've built ourselves and we've some folks engaged. Take a quick look at the right side. Right? The idea is within B2C situations, within customer-facing situations, and really in this case, consumers for the most part, these are some of the things that some folks have built up. Some on our team, some folks sitting in this audience, some of you guys have built that they've taken that just journey engine, right, this identity experience framework and created. Right, so anything from sign up while sending a welcome email from the platform using a third-party provider, 2FA with a standard industry compliant validator, such as Authy, for example, or Microsoft Authenticator, login with one button, linking of accounts, so one user, two accounts, has local accounts, has a Facebook account or has a corporate account, and when at least two of those today can be linked to the same user. It's a number of really interesting use cases that are enabled by that. And you see the rest. So the idea is, why am I even here? Well, it's because far more is possible. And we really look at you guys, honestly, to help us innovate. Because the demands and the things that your customers need, number one, you know better. Number two, there's so much to be done that we hope we can engage you guys to build the future with us. And you tell us what's missing in terms of things, Lego blocks that you need, and we'll work on that block so that you can provide and build that castle that you want to build, right? So you build we see more and more how you can build your own solutions while we provide you the infrastructure to do it. And so far, I've seen some great innovation for you, so thank you. Hopefully you're familiar with this interface we came up with recently. We will improve it over time. We have lots of ideas of how to make this a lot more usable. We know that really it's, at this point, kind of really a shell of managing your XML files, but want to make sure that you guys are aware. I'm particularly proud of the work done on policy keys, just in terms of making something extremely, to my mind, scary and complicated so easy. And we have one of the authors of that work here as well, Ronnie. But this is the interface we provide, and we hope that you could give us feedback, both in terms of organizing, and when you have many different policies, and also in terms of how do we actually build them over time, because we know this becomes a DevX exercise. I think by now, judging by the many of you who already kind of dove in, hopefully much of this doesn't become redundant. But by now, I think we get, right, that a policy is what takes configuration, both to communicate across different entities, and also that today, as you've seen it yourself, is XML-based. Important at the bottom, the point around mashable flows. I think that together with Omar a little bit later, we'll talk about dependencies, how they work, because there's some creative things that are possible there. When you talk about control, who controls access to which files, who controls access to which portions of the configuration. So you can have developers creating some policies and identity pros, or yourself perhaps managing upper level policies in a chain. It is something that we'll discuss a little bit, because it does mean that you have the ability to trust a few things to others and keep some things to yourselves. So we've seen the types of policies, and by now I think this audience is pretty familiar with the fact that our applications dictate which policy should be used, which gives flexibility to an application to call many different policies. It also allows more than one application to call the same policy if that's appropriate, and the variations can be simple things like branding. The variations could be like, one application registration is lengthier than the other. One could be that one application is less trusted, so they don't get a token that is rich as the other applications, so that this is something that's determined on the policy that each one gets to access. So this is a flexibility that opens up a lot of different scenarios. And lastly, just the session enforcement that we'll talk more about in some sessions today as well. But I think you're aware that you can enforce sessions at or SSO, the policy tenant and application level. So what are these elements? And now we're getting now into the code itself. I should say the configuration file. So we have within the XML, we have five sections. And I'm just going to introduce the top, and I'll hand it over to Omar. So what we have is, number one, the base policy. Base policy really determines who is the parent of this particular file, allowing the coexistence of multiple relying party files to call one base trust framework. So you write the base trust framework or the core file once, and you have the ability to make multiple copies or multiple variations on a policy without changing the heart of the core of it. Building blocks, I think we'll go in a bit. That describes the relationships. Claims providers are the entities that you interact with. Everything, including the human you're interacting to, is mapped or modeled as an entity. That happens to be a claims provider, a self-assertive provider. The user journeys are the step-by-steps themselves to achieve what you want to achieve. And on the way to the right is how are you going to speak back to the application? What is the application, the relying party, expecting? So I'd like to introduce Omar Iqbal. Sorry, I had a question before we move on. You bet. So this is a schema, and thank you for that. And Omar will show you here in the XML file. Think of this as the schema of our XML configuration file. The file has 5 elements, 5 macro blocks, if you will, in the schema, and the contents of each block are described here. So the first block has 1 element, the second, I believe, has 5, and so on and so forth, right? So this is just to give you the schema on how it's organized in the configuration. That's all it is. So Omar, together with a couple of engineers, was the author of this language to start with. So we're really glad to have him with us.
Thank you very much. I have the mic. Thank you very much, Mr. Jose. Let me just validate that this works or doesn't work. Okay, it works. All right, so basically what Jose said, I'll build on that. The way we have architected identity experience framework is that you can author your own trust framework, a policy that acts as, that provides basic set of rules and journeys and user experiences for other policies, your application policies, to work on it. When we started the B2C project, we did the framework before we actually came up with the B2C offering. So it is not a retrofit of going back and then trying to build a framework underneath the B2C offering. It was actually the other way around. We started with the framework, and then one of the concrete examples of whether we can utilize that framework in real world or not was to build the B2C on top of it. So this slide represents a very high level of what base policy, building blocks, claims providers, user journeys, and relying party sections are. Today and over the next few sessions tomorrow, we will actually go into each one of them. I'm going to cover some basics around what the policy is and how inheritance works, and a few sections. But then tomorrow's session, I think there is 2 or 3 sessions tomorrow where we actually go into what claims transformations are, what content definitions are, and other areas of the policy. Let me go the other way around. Okay. This is the previous slide, right? Yeah. Okay. So policy inheritance is a core concept of identity experience framework. Usually, nobody has one policy that is standalone. Typically, that's not the case. It's possible you can author one huge policy which will have everything from the user experience to how the token is minted, which protocol is used, what relying party uses, how you're going to federate with another identity provider. All of that is possible to put in one policy. But typically, the way we have seen it work effectively in practice is that it helps to isolate each one of them. So due to that, very early on, we built inheritance into the system. When I say inheritance, I mean similar to what we are used to inheritance in programming languages. We can typically have one base trust framework where we can say, these are all my user journeys, these are my identity providers that I'm going to federate with, these are the protocols they use, and then every application can go and override some of those behaviors depending on its needs. For example, one application might want to get some extra claims from a particular identity provider, or an application might need to get additional claims in the token, and it can then start modifying that base user journey, base trust framework policy. It can also modify the base user journeys to change some experience for the user. That's at a high level. I'll go through the XML snippets for each one of those. Once we had this platform, the example I was talking about, if you were to start with custom policies and download your policies, you will typically find 3 or 4 different policies. There will be a base policy, there will be an extensions policy, and there will be some application policies. If you're new to it, just bear with me. I'll show all of this through the example. That model that we have put in the starter packs when you start with custom policies is based on our personal experience of building the B2C trust framework. So if you have a tenant where you have where you go and try B2C, set up a policy through the UI. There was an earlier session by Parak where he showed how you can go and create a new policy where you can say it's a sign-up policy and I want these claims and I want them in token. Once you download that policy, you can open the XML snippet and see that it talks about a base policy. And that base policy, so this is the policy that you will, I don't think the mouse shows up, so I'll have to just walk over and talk about it. So this B2C1 policy is the policy that you are modifying on the portal. And if you download this policy, it will have a reference to a base V1 policy within your own tenant. So in the portal, you will see there are 2 sets of settings that you have. One is the settings that you are doing at the tenant level, and another set of settings that is per policy. And this is how we have broken it up in the policy inheritance. So there's a tenant level setting where you can go and say, I'm going to configure Google as an IDP. I'm going to configure Facebook as an IDP. And that's a setting that all my policies can use. And then each individual sign up, sign in, password reset, whatever setting you have, can start using those IDPs from the base V1 policy. So you end up providing your client credentials and your client ID, app ID, one time that we go and put in the base V1, the portal will do it behind the scenes. And then every policy is inheriting that data and then able to federate with each of those IDPs. Similarly, which endpoint do we go to? Like for example, if you are federating with Facebook, how do you find the endpoint? That is in the B2C trust framework base V2. There will be a reference from your base V1 policy to B2C trust framework base V2 trust framework. And that is the trust framework that we authored as part of the B2C offering. That trust framework will have, for example, the federation endpoint to Facebook. It will have what claims we are expecting, how do we normalize those claims so that when we send them the token, and one IDP is returning a first name while the other is returning a given name, how do we normalize all of those? So all of that data goes in the B2C trust framework. This is the core concept under which we basically have built the B2C trust framework. The inheritance concept came out of actually us trying to figure out how to manage these policies more effectively, especially with multiple relying parties, each relying party wanting to do something slightly different, yet using most of the stuff from other policies. Generally, the way inheritance works in the framework is that every element will have an ID. So for example, we might say that there is an identity provider that has an ID called Facebook-auth. And every time another policy goes and says there is an identity provider with Facebook-auth, it is providing the differential from the base policy. So for example, if my policy declares a small section saying Facebook OAuth and then a parent policy had Facebook OAuth, my section is only going to give the differential. And if it provides something that already exists in the base, it is going to override it. And if it's something new, it's just going to add to it. So that's generally how inheritance works. I will show all of this with examples. We have some special inheritance rules for collections. Usually in the collections, we will append by default. If you had collection of 3 claims in the base policy and 2 more that the application needs, it becomes 5, but there are special rules around how you can just modify and override it. And there's a special way of special inheritance rules around orchestration steps because they affect the user journey directly. So I'll go over those as well. Let me move forward and talk a little bit about user journeys. Anytime an application sends a request to Azure Active Directory, B2C, or in whether it's an IEF policy or a B2C policy, there is a policy ID that comes in the request. And every policy that comes in the request that is requested by the application must have what we call a default user journey. So we will always go and look up inside that policy whether there's a tag called default user journey. The name of the tag is not important. The important thing is that every request to the authorized endpoint, for example in Auth2 or whether you're using SAML or something else, has to identify a policy that must point to a user journey. And user journey is essentially the user experience that the end user goes through. So the user journey will define, on the first screen, I want to show an option of all the different identity providers that a user sees. On the second step, I want to actually federate, have IEF federate with that identity provider. So that's my second step. On the third step, I want to, for example, collect some additional claims. Let me walk through a real example here. So for example, the B2C tenant endpoint in the very first step gets the request and it will open up the user journey and go to the first step. So this is the example of what I was saying could be an identity provider screen where we show Facebook and Google and we say you can sign up using a local account or you can federate to your special SAML-based, for example, IDP. Then in the second step, we will basically go and federate with that IDP. This is a typical flow. It doesn't have to be this way because you control your policy. You can modify your XML to do anything you want in first step. I have worked with a customer who wanted in the very first step, they wanted to get the phone number and then validate the phone number because they wanted to base their experience purely on the phone number, and based on the phone number, they could immediately figure out whether the user account already exists. If it existed, it's a different flow. If it does not exist, it's a different flow. And we made it work for that scenario as well. And then after that, there will be another step in the user journey orchestration. It could be, I want to collect more claims. I want to go and create an account in an external directory, in a CRM system somewhere else. And then when the user journey ends, it will issue a token back to the application. It will redirect back. It will have the token, and the token may have some claims in it depending on the policy. So this is what we are trying to get from the policy that comes in the request. That's everything that the orchestration engine is thinking through. Each one of these steps is going to make use of the rest of the trust framework policy, which will include building blocks, claim types, everything else you saw on the slide that Jose showed earlier. So the easiest way we find to debug policies is to go through user journeys first, figure out which user journey was invoked. We'll go through one example, hopefully in this session. And then from there, we can start figuring out what are all the references and then go through those. If you have questions or if something doesn't make sense, interrupt me along the way. It will be easier because by the time I go to the end, I might have gone too far away and then it might be hard to recover. So there is also this concept of preconditions. A precondition before a user journey step specifies whether that user journey should be executed or not. It's similar to a conditional statement in a programming language, except that we don't have blocks of conditions, we just have one condition per step, or a set of conditions per step, not a block of steps. A common condition is, for example, if the phone number scenario I was talking about earlier, a precondition could say if the user, once the phone number is verified by the user and it is looked up in a directory, a precondition could say if the user does not exist in the directory, create the account first and then move forward. So that is how preconditions are normally applied in the context of a B2C policy user journey. Let me switch over to a starter pack. This is what I was talking about. When you start with custom policies, you'll get a link to our starter pack documentation. And we will typically have we have 3 or 4 different starter packs. I'll go into a bit more details about the advantages of starter packs or not, but let me go through the policy first and talk about the same thing in XML. This is the user journeys we have in the starter pack. The policy I've opened is the sign up and sign in. And if you actually, let me see. Let me actually go back to the slides first and then I'll come back to the policy. Let me do a little bit of advantage, disadvantage discussion of the starter pack. So when we give the starter packs, we have 3 or 4 different starter packs. The list of the starter packs is here. The reason we gave these starter packs was because when we ran the private preview, it turned out that a lot of people who were going in private preview did not have a very sort of a easy way to manage their policies and a well-known starting point. In many cases, in some cases, we gave our B2C trust framework. It turned out to be way too complex because we had some legacy reasons to keep a bunch of stuff in our trust framework, which does not make sense for somebody starting new. We also found out that as we modified our trust framework and gave it out, anybody who had modified our previous version of the trust framework found it very difficult to integrate the new one, the new copy. So in the starter packs, we basically try to solve some of those problems. One was that we'll just give 3 or 4 starter packs. It's a common starter pack. If you're using social accounts only, just take the social accounts. It will generally be less complicated than, for example, the social and local accounts with MFA. And it will be smaller, less to manage. But if you have a scenario where you want to do both social and local accounts, then you just pick social and local accounts and then go with that. The starter packs have some pre-built user journeys. The user journeys we have in starter packs are the same that we have in B2C portal. The goal is that once you take the starter pack and you start with custom policies, you should have some parity with what you were getting through the portal so that you can start modifying from that point onward instead of starting from scratch. So we have typically 2 or 3, I think 3 user journeys. There's a sign up, sign in, there's a profile edit, and in the local accounts user journey, there will be a password reset. So you can go through it, and those user journeys are similar to what we have in B2C. But like I was saying, for legacy reasons, we might have more in B2C trust framework. So starter pack simplifies that as well. And the third is that we structured it for change management. So we created a trust framework. We called it trust framework base. And then we provided an extensions to that trust framework via the inheritance model I was talking about earlier. So as an example, in the base trust framework, we have a complete user journey that can do a sign up or a sign in flow, or it can do a profile edit flow. It also has Facebook as an identity provider. In the social accounts, we give Facebook as a default identity provider example. So that it contains the authorized endpoint and a few other settings for Facebook, but it does not contain the client ID and the reference to the secret in your tenant, because those are very specific to your setup. In the extensions, you will typically end up providing the secret, the reference to the secret in your tenant, and the client ID. So the next time around, we change the trust framework. Let's say this happened a couple of months back. There was a breaking change where Facebook changed the API version, and once they changed, when they changed the API version, there was the format of the token was a little bit different, and you had to modify the Facebook IDP, the technical profile, the IDP in the trust framework to basically process that response correctly. So we, at that point, are able to give a new trust framework, and you will typically be able to take the trust framework and apply in your tenant, test it, and then roll it out without having to make changes in either the extensions or in app policies. So we are trying to make it work. We do get feedback from time to time from people who try the trust frameworks. We have gotten feedback about creating new user journeys. That is something that we need to still work on. We did get some feedback initially about change management. There is a bunch of other feedback about change management, but specifically around trust framework policies, if there's more as people try, we definitely want to look into that. So let me now go through the walkthrough of well, I was supposed to do it now, not earlier. So let me go through the walkthrough, and let me see if I can project what I have. All right. So this is the sample trust framework XML that if you start a starter pack, download a starter pack, and then start playing with it, it will come back with 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 XML files, and out of which trust framework base has most of the content. Since I'm looking at social and local accounts, this will have both at least one social account and a number of technical profiles for a local account. When I say technical profile, I'll talk about it in the context of claims providers later. But think of technical profile as an endpoint to which identity experience framework will federate with. So for example, theoretically, Google has multiple endpoints. It has OAuth 2 that we're already using. There's an OpenID Connect, and I believe they also have a SAML one. But between OAuth 2 and OpenID Connect, somebody could say, I have one claims provider, which is Google, and then it has an OpenID technical profile, and then it has another technical profile for OAuth 2. And then each user journey can pick and choose between those two, or even give that option to the user if it mattered at all. So technical profile is really the endpoint that contains the federation metadata. And claims provider is our generalization of whether you have an identity provider, an attribute provider, or an attribute verifier. The difference between those two typically is that the identity provider would be usually like Facebook or Google, where the user goes, types some their information, and then Google will issue a token to us. There's typically never any claims that are going in the request. In the case of attribute verifier, that is possible. It is possible that attribute verifier can behave both ways. There can be attribute verifiers where IEF redirects to attribute verifier, and attribute verifier, the user provides some information, and then we get back our response with a token, and then we start consuming that. Or there could be some claims that go into the attribute verifier because attribute verifier cannot trust everything that the user has given. For example, it is possible that IEF authenticates a user, says this is user's email address from our record, and then needs to send it back to the attribute verifier so it can look up the account data based on that email address. So that is how the attribute verifiers can also be plugged in. Same thing with attribute providers. In many cases, attribute providers and attribute verifiers can be the same. So when we were looking at this whole model, given that we are working with OAuth 2 and OpenID Connect, and and some of them support this scenario already, the claims provider is a generalization of whether you have an identity provider, an attribute verifier, or an attribute provider. And the difference would typically be whether IEF is sending claims to them, which are signed in a token and whatnot, and getting back the tokens, getting back claims as well or not. So attribute verifier might not return back claims. It might only say, hey, this all looks good, you have success. Whereas an attribute provider actually might be returning claims, some claims to IEF. So for us, it's much easier to think of all of this as claims providers and then technical profiles, where technical profile represents an actual endpoint and claims provider represents typically the entity, for example, Google or Facebook or Equifax or Experian. So in our policy, we have some basic attributes on the root element, which define the schema version that is being used, the tenant ID and the policy ID. The schema version here is used because we can have, as we go and develop more features, from time to time it may be required for us to rev the schema in ways that it is not backward compatible. So far we have not had the need to do it, but for our own validation, we actually created multiple schema versions for testing. And so 0.3 is the schema version that we have made publicly available. And as soon as IEF gets a policy ID in the request, it goes to read the policy. The first thing it will do is look at the policy schema version and then find the right schema and deserialization logic to consume that policy. So that is the primary purpose of the schema here. Tenant ID, policy ID is basically the tenant and the policy in which the tenant in which the policy resides, and policy ID is what will come in the request to find this policy. Public policy URI is more for documentation purposes. If somebody needs to publish their policy and they need to have a public URI, they can put it here so any author can look at it. The main sections that, if you remember on Jose's slide before, were these 4 sections, out of which 3 are in this policy. The 4th one I'll show you later. We typically do not put the relying party section in the base trust framework because in 90% of the cases, it has things that are specific to that particular application. So we end up putting that in the application policies only. So building blocks then has, as was exactly the case on the slide, it has 4 sections, 4 or 5 sections. This claim schema, which will contain all the claim types that this policy has to be able to deal with. It has claims transformations. It has client definitions. Claims transformations are, the examples of claims transformations could be, let's say you have a date of birth of a user, but it should not be sent to the application in a token. But the application needs to know whether the user is 18 years of age or not, or 13 years of age or not. So there could be a transformation that takes that date of birth and either converts it into years, age, whatever you want to do, or just a claim saying is user above 13, is user above 18 with a true or a false. So those kind of things are possible with claims transformations. There are other examples. Sometimes we have found it to be the case that we get a single email address from an identity provider, but the provider to which we are sending email address actually takes a collection, or the other way around. So the claims transformations allows the data type manipulation as well, where you want to convert a single claim into a collection or extract something out of a collection as a single claim, single valued claim. There are some specific examples for Active Directory. We have to create what Active Directory calls user principal name. So when we are creating a social identity provider, as of today, we still need to when we are creating a user that federated using social IDP in the directory, as of today, it must also contain a UPN. And since there is no real requirement of a UPN for a socially federated user, we actually create a random UPN. So there are some transformations that help with scenarios like that. There are transformations that will create data structures specific to the social IDP, including social IDP user, including creating what we call an AltSec ID. It is currently not exposed outside the system. We are working to expose it to external third parties as well. but there will be claims transformations that you will see. It will say create alternative security ID. So those are very specific to the directory. The more time you spend with the directory in general, with graph, AD graph and others, you'll figure out that there are these claim types that need to be added just to make some things work. I will not go through those in detail today. Probably tomorrow when we go through the claims provider sections. So let me go through a sample user journey. Let me go to. I'll try to first explain the user journey I'm going to walk through, and then I'll show the XML. So the user journey I'm going to walk through is the sign up or sign in. It is the most commonly used user journey. In fact, when we started B2C, we only had a sign up user journey and a sign in user journey. And we got a ton of feedback around the user experience being very weird because the user had to explicitly select, I want to sign up or sign in. And then once they would go to an IDP screen where they had Facebook or Google or something else, and they had already signed up, but they went to sign up and Facebook again, they would get an error saying, you're already signed up, please go back and sign in. And so sign up or sign in user journey was actually initially created to solve that problem, where as soon as a user lands on a page, it shows identity providers, which is very common user experience today, where you'll see Facebook, Google, or it will say log in with your own, for example, local account, or if you, let's say you are New York Times. I'm just picking a random example. It might say Google, Facebook, log in with your New York Times account, right? Where you can provide your email address and password. And then there will be another link at the bottom saying, don't have an account, create one here, something like that. So that is how the sign up or sign in user experience is created in B2C. And this policy orchestrates that entire user experience. And so it has a lot of preconditions around what if this is a local account. When I say local account, it was basically, where I said, create your own New York Times account or create your own Stack Overflow account. So those are called local accounts in the directory. So there's local account and then there's a socially federated account. So because there is this logic around social accounts and local accounts, we have a bunch of preconditions trying to figure out when a user federates through a social IDP, we want to immediately check in the directory whether the user exists or not. And if the user exists, we take them through the sign-in experience. And if a user does not exist, the user account does not exist in the directory, then we take them through the sign-up experience. And that's what makes the sign-up or sign-in a bit more complicated, especially in the social and local accounts starter pack. That's why we have other starter packs where if you don't need this, you only are dealing with local accounts or social accounts, then a lot of this policy becomes simpler. So let me walk through the user journey. This is basically how the actual user journey is authored in XML. Jose spent a lot of time converting into English so we can understand it now. So we'll go through the English version first. So the first page will show the IDP provider selection. The user sees the page, and then the user will, and it already will say, you have a question? Sorry, I didn't understand. Oh, I see. So I would say let's skip it for now. I think I'll come back to that later because I'm also doing a little bit of time check. I was joking with Jose that in America it's almost sacred to have lunch between noon and 1, and I'm already hungry. So I don't want to hold everybody beyond 1 at least. So I'll basically come to that in another session probably. So the IDP. So for first page, the user shows IDP. User is shown the IDP selection page, and on that page there is also saying that there's also 2 checkboxes. One where they can provide their user ID and their password, and so user can immediately go and say my email address is this, my password is this, and I want to sign in. So if that happens, which is the 1B section, then immediately B2C will try to log in the user and do a password check. If the password fails, the user is still on step 1. Nothing has changed. So user will still see an error saying incorrect credentials, and user still has the options to either go to Facebook instead, or then try their password again and whatnot. So in the second step, we do a precondition where we say if the user has already signed in, then skip this step. This is unnecessary. But if the user has not signed in, they will typically have selected a social IDP, so we need to federate. The reason this federation is a second step is because it's a change in the user experience. User sees a browser change to Facebook, user will be rendered a new page in second step, which will be served by Facebook or Google or any other IDP you have. So from a user experience point of view, it changes. It is also possible that in the first step, the user had said, I want to create a new account. So in the second step, we will show a screen saying, give your first name, last name, whatever else application needs, and then the user can provide that information. So then we go to step 3. In the step 3, we check that if it was a local account, we want to skip this step because we are basically trying to do two things at the same time. One is if the user had selected social account, we are going into the directory trying to find out if the user exists. If it doesn't exist, we need to create the user account. But if it's a local account, we need to skip that step. So the third step will skip in the case of local account, but it's gonna go and try to find the user using their social ID, and this is the alternative security ID I was talking about. We usually say AltSec ID as short. The actual long name in the directory is called alternative security ID. In the fourth step determines, by this time, we have already done a check in the directory to see if the social account exists or not. If the user's account exists in the directory or not. If it does not exist, then that means the user has authenticated using a social IDP and we need to register the user. So in the fourth step, there's a registration page with all the attributes that user can provide and then attempt to create the account. In the fifth step, we basically go and do the fifth step is back about the local accounts. By this time, if it was a social account, it has either we have already found in the directory or we have already created the account in the directory if it's a social account. So we are still left with the local account where the local account sign-in might have just happened. So in the case of local account sign-in, we go into the directory and try to read all the attributes based on the object ID of the user. So the object ID was retrieved in the first step when the user did their username and password. At that time, we validated the password. So during the validation of the password, user's object ID is retrieved from the directory. So in the fifth step, all those attributes are read. The reason we have to add this additional step is that when we do an authentication in the first step to validate the user password, the token that comes back may not have all the attributes that are needed for the application. For example, the application might have said, I want some custom attributes that have been created in the directory. So in the first step, the token has very limited set of claims that are retrieved during password validation. Fifth step actually goes to directory and gets all the claims that are required to be issued by IEF in the token. In the sixth step, which is almost the last step, if the user does not exist in the directory, then we create a social federated user in the directory. Oh, this is a special case. So yes, this is a special case. It's hard to explain, but I'll try. Okay. So there are two scenarios in the social IDP authentication case. One scenario is where when it's a new user, you need to collect some attributes. So a screen should be shown. Whereas there can be cases, there are applications that do not want to collect any attributes. That just say, hey, select Facebook, whatever claims Facebook returns, don't show user any other screen, just land them in the application. And so if that had happened, we would have skipped steps 3, 4, 5, all of them. But in that case, the user account is still not created because when I was saying, for example, this is a social account, this social account was found, this local account. Yes. So in this case, we get attributes of the social IDP from the user, right? And in this case, we sign up the user using the social IDP. So we sign up the user using social IDP, we go and try to find it in the directory. If we don't find the account, we still have to create the account of the user in the directory. And during this step, we can either show that page or skip that page. So that is covered in the 6th step. And in the last steps, creates a jot token and sends it back to the application. So this is one of the most complex user journeys. Internally, we have talked multiple times about simplifying how we author user journeys when you have so many preconditions where we have a local account that is a registration versus a local account that is a sign-in versus a social account that's a registration versus a social account that's a sign-in. And if you add MFA or something else on top of it, it makes it even more complex. So we are trying to figure out how to simplify this further. But as of now, this is a very good example of how to at least make the existing preconditions work with the user journey. I think we're already almost out of time, so we should skip the XML, and then when we start the next section, we can continue where we are leaving off. I'll go briefly through this again, and then we can go into XML, and then we can go in the other sections. If anybody has questions, I'm here. If nobody's going to ask questions, so we can have lunch, then I'm here still. You can just come here and ask me any questions you might have. All right, thank you, everybody. Yes.
All the custom policy sessions. So whatever we cover here, we'll pick up on this. And we have twice as much content as we have time. All the technical stuff will be available to you guys. None of this is the NDA. So I think everything else is practically available. Did I hear a question?
Yeah, so the DSL that you guys have created, I never been able to see anything online that kind of helps me understand your DSL. See some great user guides like, hey, I want to go call this REST API. This is the bit you put in there.
So what do you mean by DSL?
Your domain-specific language.
I see.
You were describing.
Yeah.
A lot of your content that you gave us here today, is that written down anywhere on docs.microsoft.com, or is that, I'm just getting that when I come here?
I think that's a good question for Jose. And he's running away.
It is a good question. We have that. The reason that the complete DSL describes scenarios that we have not yet tested. So we've on purpose, but this is going to change very quickly, have documented guides on how to do specific things rather than documented the full language where people run to corner cases. We had the experience doing the private preview of a lot of corner cases that we didn't want to kind of throw up onto the community all at once. But we're ready, I get it. And in these sessions, you're going to see all the language described in the sessions. We have enough slides that describe every element in detail. But send me an email and I'll send it to you.
Just as a follow-up to that, so if you download the starter pack, there's also an XSD, which describes each of the nodes. I mean, that's not a complete, how do they all link together? Right.